guys, so today we're going to take some time to talk a little bit about Herbert Hoover and the responses that he had to the Great Depression. So you should have a worksheet that looks a little bit like this. It says Hoover has history judged him too harshly. On this side it says responsive and flexible. On this side it says unresponsive. So let's just jump right in. So the thing about Herbert Hoover, right, is that he becomes president right off of the era of the Roaring Twenties. It's an era that was a prosperous time in America. He is very much like the presidents that came before him, Harding and Coolidge. He was successful in the U.S. Food Administration. He had served on the cabinets of both Harding and Coolidge. He was a very popular guy. It kind of makes sense that he was the one to get elected. Problem is, he's elected in 1928, inaugurated in the beginning of 1929. In October of 1929, the stock market crashes. And basically that is the beginning of the end of Herbert Hoover. As a president, Herbert Hoover has gotten this reputation of being someone who was maybe a terrible president, not very good for the country. The theme I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about Hoover is that really a deserved reputation for him? So as we go through here, we're going to talk a little bit about the things that he did and maybe the things that he didn't do that maybe he should have done as the president during the Great Depression. At the end, I'm going to let you kind of make your mind up on what you think is Hoover's deserved reputation, what it should be. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So we'll start with things that he did that were responsive or flexible to the Depression. So if you look at this political cartoon, this is a pro-Hoover political cartoon, and it's called rail splitting, all right? So if you don't know anything about cutting logs, you might have to know about that to understand the symbolism here. So in order to cut a big log, you need a splitter, right? It's this metal piece that goes like this. You nail it into the log, and eventually it'll start forming cracks in the log to allow you to cut it much more easily. So this political cartoon, the log is the Great Depression. And if you look at the splitters, on it are the things that Hoover did that are starting to crack the log of the Depression, right? So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. So we're going to start with the first thing that Hoover does, which is trying to get people back to work. He puts about $800 million towards getting people construction jobs, such as the Boulder Dam is probably the best example. The Boulder Dam would go on to be renamed the Hoover Dam, which is what you probably know it as, in Herbert Hoover's honor. And so this is one of the most amazing engineering feats in our nation's history. It's both beneficial to the area, but also requires a lot of people to work it and gets a lot of people to work. So if you look at this, these pictures here, you can see kind of the construction here. The Hoover Dam was built on the Colorado River, right across the state lines of Arizona and Nevada. An area that needs a lot of water, needed electricity, so it kind of made sense. Just to look at some pictures here, the Hoover Dam is an expansive undertaking. You can see it's really big from Google Maps here. Just if you don't understand the way a dam works, this top of the river with the dam is holding the water back so it can be used in Arizona and Nevada. Down here, it's still a rushing river that's going to be used. So, like I said, massive undertaking. If you look at it, you can see how big it is. You can see the water at the back that's being held back, the water at the bottom that's still rushing. You've probably seen pictures of the Hoover Dam before. Maybe you've even been there. I got to go there when I was 13. It was pretty cool. But again, a really massive feat of undertaking. The problem, of course, with something like the Hoover Dam is that you have to move, right? You can't just live at home unless you're from Nevada, right? However, it is important that people were getting back to work. The next thing that Hoover does that's considered responsive is that he cuts taxes across the board. This kind of goes back into the idea of trickle-down economics, that if you cut taxes, then more people will spend money. Maybe you have a little extra cash in your pocket, right? It goes into the theory of trickle-down economics. The next thing that he did is something called volunteerism. So volunteerism is exactly what it sounds like, volunteer. And so he did two kinds of volunteerism. The first is he tries to encourage charities and churches to do kind of their part. If you look at this photograph down at the bottom, it says, free hot coffee and donuts for the unemployed. But he also asked businesses to volunteer. And what he asked them to do is to volunteer to freeze wages and prices. So what this means is if you have a wage freeze, you won't decrease the price of your wages. So let's say a small business pays somebody $7 an hour, but in order to save money, they decide they're going to cut wages to $5 an hour. right? Well, with a wage freeze, you can't do that. Same with a price freeze. Let's say that whatever you sell notebooks at your business and you sell them for $5. Well, in order to make more money, maybe you say, I'm going to raise the price to $7. Well, if you lower wages, it's going to make it harder for people to make a living. If you cut prices, it's going to make it harder for people to, or if you raise prices, it's going to make it harder for people to buy what they need. So the idea here is that businesses will volunteer to do this. But as you know, businesses are not going to be super open to volunteering, so that is something that maybe he could have done a little bit more with. But at least he is asking and trying to get them to do something. The next thing that we have here are some of the different laws that he puts into place. So the first is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So the idea is to get businesses and banks back on their feet by loaning money to businesses and banks. The second one is the Home Loan Bank Act. So the idea behind this one is that they loan money out for house payments for people who haven't been able to afford their mortgage so that they can keep their house. The second one that we have is the Federal Farm Marketing Board. So the Federal Farm Marketing Board the goal is to sell some of this excess food that has been around, right? So think about part of the problem with the Great Depression was that there was too much food. And so the idea behind this is to advertise people to buy certain kinds of foods. The 90s did this. There was a lot of food marketing in the 90s. You might remember the Got Milk ads. Maybe like if you've ever heard like pork, it's the other white meat, or beef, it's what's for dinner, right? So they're trying to encourage people to support the beef industry by buying beef, right? And this kind of, again, goes back to Herbert Hoover's time as the head of the Food Administration. So these are some good things that Hoover did, right? Pretty responsive, maybe not as responsive as he could have been, but he does try, and he probably does as much or more than any president in his position would have. He definitely did what had worked in the past during economic recessions. The problem was this wasn't like any other economic recession, right? This was a whole new kind of ballgame. So a lot of people said maybe some of the things he did were not responsive. So the first thing is that he never makes any direct cash payments to the poor. He really feels this is not the government's job. Loan money to businesses, yes, but giving handouts, that's a little too much. This is actually something that throughout America, there's this idea called rugged individualism, where it's basically like man picks himself up by his own bootstraps and does his own kind of thing. If you look at this quote down here from Hoover, it says, "While I can make no claim for having introduced the term rugged individualism, it's not mine, I should be proud to have invented it. It has been used by American leaders for over half a century in eulogy of those God-fearing men and women of honesty whose stamina and character and fearless assertion of rights led them to make their own way in life," right? So that's what rugged individualism is about, making your own way. The problem is a lot of these people who would have loved to have made their own way couldn't because of the way this depression was. He also favored volunteerism over laws, right? So again, encourage charities and churches to help. But if that's all you're doing, that's not enough. The government needs to step in as well. So volunteerism is both a good and a bad thing in certain aspects. The other thing he really believes in is limited government. And this comes out with a lot of issues between the president and Congress. So the Congress was Democratic controlled this time. They want to spend over $40 billion to kind of do welfare. Hoover says that's way too much money. That's too much for the government. Hoover wants to spend only $2 billion, right? So a lot of people said, well, maybe you're not doing quite enough. Maybe you could be putting more money into this or putting more into it. A lot of people also kind of argued that you're spending more time arguing with Congress. Shocker, right? This is not something that's new. So you see this political cartoon, a few little smacks under the mistletoe being relief legislation and harmony and hope, right? But we've got the president and Congress, a husband and wife, who are beating each other up rather than, trying to solve the issue. Another thing that Hoover does that's seen as very unresponsive deals with a group called the Bonus Army. So the Bonus Army were a group of World War I vets, and they were scheduled to get their pensions from World War I in 1945. However, a lot of these guys are the ones who are not able to get their jobs. So they marched to Washington, D.C. to ask for their pensions early. Congress refuses, tells them to go home. Like, get out of here. They refused to leave. They actually set up some shanty towns on the outskirts of the capital in order to say, we're not going anywhere until we get what we're asking for. Herbert Hoover sends in Douglas MacArthur. That's this guy pictured right here. And Douglas MacArthur, he's kind of gung-ho. He drives back the bonus army and drives them back to their little shanty town and starts burning down the place. Things had been peaceful for a while, but some of the soldiers started to fight back. He burns down the town, starts firing into crowds. He puts tear gas out there to drive them off. A baby is actually killed because they had brought their families with them. Douglas MacArthur had gone way beyond what he was supposed to do. However, Herbert Hoover takes the responsibility for it. Basically, it's partly his own, where he says, I'm not going to throw MacArthur under the bus. I should have been able to keep a type of rein on him. However, because he doesn't blame anybody else, people assume that this was Hoover's responsibility and that he had ordered this. And it made him seem pretty heartless. Hoover never ordered this. I should clarify. That's not what he wanted. But he gets the blame for it, and it seemed really unresponsive at the time. So just some pictures here. This is some of the marches. You can see, like, we decide when to come, we decide when to go. This is saying, you know, we're not going to leave until we get what we want. Pay the bonus now. I love the 1917 was nothing was good. 1932, nothing is right. There's one, I think it's in this picture, maybe not, where it says we'll be dead by 1945 if we don't get our pensions, right, because we're going to starve to death. This is the march on the Capitol building. So you can see these guys are basically just standing outside the Capitol saying, we want our pensions, right? They're, you know, these are guys that are in their 40s, 50s by this point. They need something to support their families. This is a photograph once the shantytown goes up in flames. And you can see this is a really striking picture because the U.S. Capitol building's right in the background right there. This is more of a up-close picture of the fight between, these are the guys on the left, or the soldiers. These guys are the police, or the men under MacArthur's reign. So this was a pretty big deal. This actually happened during the election year in 1932. And according to the story, when FDR, who was running against Herbert Hoover, heard about this, he said, this elects me, right? Like this is the nail in Herbert Hoover's coffin, and it really kind of was. The last thing that we have here, this is not really something that Hoover did, but it's about Hoover's name itself. Hoover's name becomes associated with poverty while he was president. So if you look down here, the sign that these kids are sitting in front of says Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. Hard times are still hoovering over us instead of hovering over us, right? But that's not where it ended, right? So Hoovervilles, little cardboard shanties outside of town. This one's outside of Seattle. You can see these are just lean-tos, cardboard boxes, some of them, rustic little houses that people who've lost their homes are now living in. Every city had a Hooverville outside of it. They would even call the buildings like Hoover Hotels or Hoover Homes. If you had a car but couldn't afford to put gas in it, you hitched your horse up to it and called it a Hoover wagon. So this is a car, not a wagon, right? But you can't afford to put gas in it, so now it's a Hoover wagon. A lot of these homeless people are sleeping under blankets of newspapers, so they call them Hoover blankets. Your pockets, when you got no money in them, you turn them inside out because you're broke. Those were known as Hoover flags, right? So Herbert Hoover's name is really kind of thrown around and thrown under the bus, really, as people in this time really thought that he wasn't doing enough. So the question is, how do we evaluate Herbert Hoover? You know, was he a guy who was doing the best he knew how to do and did some things, or was he a guy who was stuck to his principles and wasn't willing to do enough to do this? So in class, I'm going to ask you to reevaluate and kind of look at Herbert Hoover and evaluate him for yourself and what you think was the best option. Did he do the right thing, or could he have done more? As we get on, we're going to kind of see how FDR responded to these same issues and how it was different. But that kind of wraps up this. So I will see you soon. Bye.